June 19, 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea, and Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Thatcher was bored out of his mind, circling at 18,000 feet in his F4F Wildcat while the sun beat down on his canopy and sweat soaked through his flight suit. He'd been on combat air patrol for 90 minutes, watching nothing but empty blue sky and endless ocean, the kind of patrol where your biggest enemy isn't the Japanese but the urge to fall asleep at the controls. His squadron had launched from the carrier Lexington 2 hours ago, 6 Wildcats spread out in a protective screen. But somewhere between the third radio check and the fourth lazy turn, his radio had started crackling with static before dying completely, leaving him flying in silence with nothing but the drone of his engine for company. He wasn't worried yet because radio failures happened all the time, and he could still see his wingman about a mile to the east, so he kept his position and tried to stay alert even though nothing was happening. Then everything happened at once. His wingman suddenly banked hard right and dove, disappearing below the cloud layer without any hand signal or warning, leaving Thatcher completely alone in the sky, and when he looked around trying to figure out what had spooked his buddy, he saw them. 83 Japanese Zero fighters flying in perfect formation at 15,000 feet, stacked in layers like a deadly staircase climbing through the sky, all of them heading directly toward where his carrier group was steaming about 40 miles to the south. He counted them twice because his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't a patrol or a scouting force. This was a full strike package designed to sink American carriers, and he was the only thing between them and the fleet. And here's the thing. This moment gets absolutely insane. So if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week. And trust me, what happens next defies all logic. Thatcher's situation was mathematically impossible to survive because the Zero was faster than his Wildcat, could turn tighter than his Wildcat, could climb better than his Wildcat, and there were 83 of them versus one of him. He couldn't run because they'd catch him in minutes, couldn't fight because he'd last about 15 seconds before getting shot to pieces, and couldn't warn the fleet because his radio was dead, and by the time he flew back to physically alert them, the Japanese would already be dropping bombs on American ships. He had maybe 2 minutes before the Japanese spotted him, and in that 2 minutes he needed to make a choice that would either save his fleet or get him killed, and probably both. The smart play was to run, dive for the deck and hope they didn't chase him, maybe survive to fight another day, but Thatcher kept thinking about the 4,500 sailors on his carrier who had no idea death was coming for them at 200 miles per hour. His flight instructor back in Pensacola had hammered one thing into every pilot's head: the Wildcat couldn't dogfight a Zero, but it could dive faster and it could take more punishment, so if you're outmatched you use what you've got, not what you wish you had. Thatcher looked at the Japanese formation below him, thought about what diving at maximum speed into 83 enemy fighters would do to his life expectancy, and realized he'd already made his decision before his brain caught up to it. He pushed the stick forward and pointed his Wildcat straight down at the center of the Japanese formation. The Grumman F4F Wildcat could dive at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour before the airframe started shaking itself apart, and Thatcher intended to find out exactly where that limit was because he needed every mile per hour of velocity he could get for what came next. His altimeter unwound like a broken clock as he dropped from 18,000 feet toward the Japanese formation 3,000 feet below him, the wind screaming past his canopy and his engine howling at full throttle while gravity and momentum turned his chunky fighter into a 13,000-pound bullet falling out of the sky. He wasn't aiming at any specific Zero, he was aiming at the space right in the middle of their formation where they were packed tightest. And at 430 miles per hour he hit them like a meteor crashing into a flock of birds. The Japanese never saw him coming because they were looking ahead toward their target, and nobody expects a lone American fighter to dive straight through the middle of 83 Zeros like a maniac with a death wish. So when Thatcher's Wildcat came screaming through their formation, they scattered in every direction trying to avoid a mid-air collision. 3 Zeros pulled up hard, 5 rolled left, 6 broke right, and the tight bombing formation that had taken them 30 minutes to assemble fell apart in seconds as pilots tried to figure out what the hell had just exploded through their ranks. The squadron leader was screaming on the radio trying to reorganize, But half his pilots had lost sight of their wingmen in the chaos, and the other half were looking around frantically trying to find the crazy American who just committed suicide by dive-bombing a fighter formation. But Thatcher wasn't done because the dive was just the setup for the real insanity. He bottomed out at 2,000 feet with his airspeed still showing 410 miles per hour, and instead of continuing to run like any sane person would, he pulled back on the stick so hard his vision started to tunnel from the G-forces, bringing his Wildcat's nose up in a screaming climb that sent him rocketing back up into the belly of the Japanese formation from below. This was the move that made absolutely zero sense from a survival standpoint, but perfect sense from a tactical one, because the Zeros were expecting him to run and had organized their pursuit accordingly, pointing their noses down to chase what they thought was a fleeing American. When Thatcher came blasting up from underneath them at climbing speed with his 650 caliber machine guns blazing, they couldn't shoot back without risking hitting their own planes because he was surrounded by friendly aircraft in every direction. One Zero took rounds through its engine and started trailing smoke. Another tried to dive away and nearly collided with the plane below him, and the entire formation dissolved into complete chaos as Japanese pilots tried to kill one American while not accidentally killing each other in the process. Thatcher rolled inverted, dove through a gap between two Zeros that couldn't have been more than 30 feet wide, pulled up again on the other side while stitching tracers across another enemy plane's wing, and basically turned the orderly Japanese strike into a furious mess of planes going in every direction with no coordination whatsoever. He had no plan beyond causing maximum chaos for as long as possible, and it was working better than he'd ever dreamed because every second the Japanese spent trying to reorganize was another second his fleet had to prepare for the attack. What the Japanese strike leader didn't realize was that his radio transmissions were being picked up by American ships even though Thatcher couldn't hear them, and when the Japanese formation suddenly broke apart and started shouting about an American fighter attacking them, the carrier Lexington's Combat Information Center immediately understood what was happening. The air boss scrambled every available fighter on deck, launching 40 Wildcats and Hellcats in 8 minutes flat, and vectored them toward the Japanese position that was now 12 minutes behind schedule because one pilot had decided personal survival was less important than buying time. Those 12 minutes were the difference between Japanese bombs hitting American carriers with their decks full of fueling aircraft versus hitting carriers with clear decks and combat air patrol overhead, and everyone in the fleet knew it. Meanwhile, Thatcher was learning that making 83 enemy pilots angry at you simultaneously was not a recipe for a long life because the Zeros were recovering from their surprise and now they wanted blood. He ducked below a stream of tracers that would have cut him in half, rolled hard right to avoid another burst, climbed into a cloud bank for 5 seconds of breathing room, and came out the other side to find 3 Zeros waiting for him like they'd read his mind. The leader fired and Thatcher felt rounds punch through his left wing, punching holes big enough to stick his fists through while shredded metal peeled away in the slipstream. He stood the Wildcat on its wing and dove again, this time heading for the deck with absolutely no plan except to stay alive for another 30 seconds, then another 30 after that, then another, until he either died or ran out of ammunition or some miracle saved him. The miracle came in the form of 4 American Hellcats that had raced ahead of the main fighter group, and when they arrived over the Japanese formation, they found the most bizarre combat scene any of them had ever witnessed. One shot-up Wildcat playing 3-dimensional keep-away with what looked like every Zero in the Japanese Navy. The Hellcat leader didn't ask questions, he just picked the closest Zero and opened fire, and suddenly the hunters became the hunted as American reinforcements tore into the scattered Japanese formation that was still trying to reorganize from Thatcher's initial attack. The air battle that followed lasted 17 minutes and involved over 120 aircraft, but by the time it ended, the Japanese had lost 19 Zeros and the chance to launch a coordinated strike on the American carriers, while Thatcher had somehow survived with nothing but a shot-up wing and a story nobody was going to believe. When Thatcher finally landed back on the Lexington 40 minutes later with his fuel gauge showing empty and his plane looking like it had been through a shredder, the entire carrier deck crew stopped what they were doing to stare because word had already spread about the crazy pilot who'd attacked 83 Japanese fighters by himself. The air boss called him to the bridge and asked him to explain his tactical thinking, which was a polite way of asking why he decided to commit suicide in such a spectacular fashion, and Thatcher's answer was pretty simple. He couldn't outrun them, couldn't outfight them, couldn't warn anybody, so he figured he might as well ruin their whole day before they killed him. The air boss stared at him for a long moment before saying that was either the dumbest or the smartest thing he'd ever heard, and he wasn't sure which. The battle reports from that day show how close the Japanese had come to catching the American carriers completely vulnerable, with planes spotted on deck and fuel lines running everywhere, which would have turned the flight deck into a fireball if bombs had started landing. Instead, the carriers had 12 extra minutes to launch fighters, spot their remaining aircraft below decks, and man their anti-aircraft guns, which meant when the Japanese finally arrived, they flew into a wall of defensive fire that shot down 8 more planes before they could even begin their attack runs. The Japanese strike commander wrote in his after-action report that the mission failed because an unexpected American fighter disrupted their approach and delayed their attack, and he recommended future strike packages avoid single-plane interdiction by maintaining tighter formation discipline, which missed the entire point of what Thatcher had accomplished. What Thatcher understood that day was something the Navy would later teach to every fighter pilot in the Pacific. Speed and aggression could beat numbers and maneuverability if you used them right, and sometimes the craziest option was the only option that made sense. The Wildcat couldn't dogfight a Zero in a turning battle, but it could dive faster, absorb more damage, and hit harder with its 6 heavy machine guns compared to the Zero's lighter cannons, so Wildcat pilots learned to fight vertically instead of horizontally, using boom and zoom tactics that traded altitude for speed and turned every engagement into a high-speed slashing attack instead of a prolonged dogfight. Thatcher had taken that concept and cranked it up to insane levels by diving through an entire formation at speeds that would have torn apart a Zero's lighter airframe, and then climbing back up to attack from an angle they weren't defending. The Navy awarded Thatcher the Navy Cross for his actions that day, though the citation was carefully worded to avoid explicitly endorsing suicidal dive attacks as official tactics, and his plane was patched up and returned to service with 83 small Japanese flags painted on the fuselage under the cockpit, 1 for each Zero he'd engaged. Other pilots started asking him for advice on how to fight when outnumbered, and his answer was always the same. Figure out the one thing your plane does better than theirs, then force them to fight your fight instead of their fight. And never ever hesitate once you've committed, because hesitation in combat gets you killed faster than bad tactics. He flew 63 more combat missions before the war ended, shot down 7 confirmed Japanese planes and probably several more that were never verified, and survived 4 more situations where he should have died but didn't because he'd learned that sometimes being too stupid to quit was more valuable than being smart enough to run. The Japanese never figured out it was just one pilot who disrupted their attack that day because their reports kept referring to multiple American fighters harassing their formation, and they spent weeks analyzing what they thought was a new American tactic involving small groups of fighters attacking from multiple angles. The Navy didn't correct this misunderstanding because having the Japanese worried about phantom fighter tactics was almost as valuable as actually having those tactics, and several times over the next few months American commanders would deliberately launch single fighters toward Japanese formations just to see if they could replicate Thatcher's chaos effect. It worked about half the time, which was a better success rate than anyone expected from what was essentially organized insanity disguised as strategy. By the summer of 1945, American carrier groups were operating with such overwhelming fighter superiority that Japanese strike packages couldn't get anywhere near the fleet without being intercepted and destroyed, but that dominance started with moments like Thatcher's dive when one pilot decided that his life was worth trading for 12 minutes of warning time. The combat air patrol doctrine changed to emphasize aggressive interception over conservative defense, and pilots were trained that disrupting enemy formations before they could attack was more important than achieving personal kills, which meant the Navy had officially adopted the lesson Thatcher had taught them the hard way. The Wildcat that couldn't dogfight a Zero had figured out how to beat 83 of them through pure violence and commitment, and the Japanese never saw it coming. Thanks for watching this story from the WW2 vault about the pilot who dove straight into impossible odds and lived to tell about it. Next week we're covering the moment a German U-boat commander realized he was hunting something that was hunting him back. Hit subscribe so you catch that one, and we'll see you in the next story.